everyone. My name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. Today we are going to be talking about something that I've wanted to discuss here in my channel for a very long time, and that is the concept that enjoyment does not equal consent. And this idea is, I think, a little bit difficult to grasp sometimes, especially in a kink context. And I actually found a really great post over on the r/BDSM community subreddit that I think does a very good job of introducing this topic. So what we're going to do today is we are going to read this post from Reddit. I am going to give my response to it, some additional thoughts, and really just use it as a jumping off point for a larger conversation about consent and how that looks in kink and how that can be a little bit confusing sometimes. But with all that being said, let's get started by reading that post over on Reddit. Recently, there was a post in which the OP described a situation where they were forced into humiliation play. Naturally, consent was brought up, and one user described it as such. If you want to know if this is consensual humiliation, ask yourself if you liked it or not. Frankly, I'm appalled at how many upvotes this got, and that there's a couple replies agreeing with them. I know this user was trying to help the OP, but this level of misinformation is harmful, and I'm shocked that some of the users here agree. Consent is not whether you like something. Consent is all people involved in an activity discussing and agreeing upon it. For example, Dom, I want to explore my humiliation kink. I'd like to insult you while you do something else. Is that something you'd be up for? Sub, sure, I'm good with most insults, but calling me worthless and gross are off limits. Consent is not starting a new kink and hoping your partner enjoys it. Even if you get lucky and everyone has a fun time, it's still poor form, and a discussion of consensual play needs to happen. On the flip side, not enjoying something isn't synonymous with non-consent. Someone could try a new kink and not enjoy it. There's plenty of examples where a couple tries a new kink, neither of them use the safe word, and the next day one of them says, actually, I didn't like it that much. I don't want to do it again. They're revoking consent for that play in the future, but that doesn't make the night prior a violation. As another example, if I'm enjoying a scene but get a low blood sugar episode, I need to safe word. Liking the scene doesn't negate the need for it to stop for the sake of my health. TLDR, consent and enjoyment are not synonyms. And oh boy, did this whole conversation stir up a lot of strong thoughts for some people. And I definitely know people in the scene outside of it who have a very particular view of consent that I think follows more along this framework of what I would call pleasure-focused consent, where there's this mentality that talking about it too much ahead of time ruins the moment, it spoils it. So instead, you don't talk about it at all and just go off of vibes. And then if the vibes are good, that usually means it was consensual. And then if it wasn't good, if it wasn't pleasurable, well, then maybe we start to question the consent of that scenario. Because clearly, if you don't like something, you should always stop whatever is happening. You shouldn't even have to say you want it to stop. It should just automatically be something that ends. But in kink, that's a lot harder of a line to draw, because it's very common for people to scream, shout, say no, say they hate you, say they hate what's happening, and then at the end, if you ask them after aftercare is done whether or not they liked the scene, they'd be like, oh my gosh, yeah, that was amazing. I got to scream and cry and do this. I feel so much release. I see so much catharsis happening here for me, and I'm very glad I got to have that experience. And it's like, okay, that just makes everything very confusing for a lot of people. And I think if you're trying to follow that model of consent, most of the time for a lot of people, it will work out okay. but a lot of times it does lead to confusion and assumptions, and yeah, it's not good form because you can't really assume that because it was good, it was always consensual, or because it was bad, it was therefore non-consensual. And it's one thing, we'll talk about this more later, if you do say you want it to stop or you don't like it or ow that hurts, that should be at the very least, a moment for a check-in, and probably switching to something entirely different, having a conversation, going, okay, I hear you, what do you want to do instead? What do you want to do next? Should we stop this? And always having that room for open negotiation, open conversation during the activity itself, whether it be vanilla or whether it be kinky. Oh, I don't really know if I want to give credit for this, but I will bring up this point because I imagine some people are thinking about it, is I think when a lot of people say they have problems with something like the revocable part of the Fry's model of consent, which says that consent is revocable at any time, I think this is what people are worried about, is they're thinking, what? You mean afterwards they can say they don't like it and then just decide I assaulted them? Like, that doesn't make any sense. That's dangerous. It's going to put people in prison for no reason. We're going to have all these people that are being accused of being horrible criminals and it's for no reason. And they panic because in their minds, the reason why somebody would revoke consent retroactively is not because of something like they were under the influence or they were coerced. It would be because, they decided it didn't go well, I didn't please them enough, and so now they're going to make false statements about my character because I didn't perform well enough. And I'm not going to say that would never ever happen. Of course, there are always going to be outliers and bad actors. It's going to be part of reality, but I don't think that's going to ever be the majority, but we are going to stay with that being a higher risk if we continue to communicate in vanilla media especially that consent is based upon how much you enjoy something or not. Like, think about any vanilla media you've seen with a romantic scene in it and people throwing their clothes off and just going at each other, and like the indication, even without words, is that it's pleasurable and therefore it's fine. But then when you see examples of non-consent, it's rough, it's painful, it's terrible, it's bad, and we just keep reinforcing this idea that if you like something, it'll feel good, it'll be consensual, and then the opposite also being true. And I think in order to combat that, what we need to do is instead talk about consent as a process you do using something like the Fry's model and indicating to people that consent is something you have to establish. It can't generally be assumed. Now, when you're getting into power exchange relationships and long-term relationships where you've had these conversations already, you've been together for a very long time, you don't necessarily always need to go in as much detail as you do with a brand new partner. But I always advocate that I think that the best practice you can do is be as thorough as possible, as upfront as possible, to make sure you're both going to get the scenario that you want. Because the last thing you want to have happen is, in your head, you're assuming I'm going to be able to deep kiss this person, we're going to be able to have an amazing makeout session, and then they're thinking, oh my god, I really hope they don't kiss me, I hate it, it's disgusting, it just, like, the sensory input of it is gross to me. Like, you could very much end up in a scenario like that if you don't talk about things like consent ahead of time, and then you could have avoided that, had an amazing time, but because you didn't talk about it, you just went right through it, and then everything had to stop. It was really awkward. It was just not a good time for anyone involved. So I think we need to have more conversations about the nuances of what consent can really look like, and how consent is about establishing that something is okay ahead of time, having that conversation, and again, following something like the Fry's model. Now, one popular model of consent that a lot of people use to avoid this problem is enthusiastic consent. And if you've been on my channel for a long time, you likely already know my thoughts about so-called enthusiastic consent. And I think for most people, like if you're somebody watching this and you enjoy that model, please keep using it. It does work for most people. But for me, as an asexual person, and many other people who aren't asexual that are masochists or service subs, this model doesn't work quite so well. I think the intention of it is good and positive. However, the way that it's largely been interpreted and implemented is, in order to consent to anything, you must be able to give an enthusiastic heck yes. You know, you must be bouncing off the walls with joy and be like, absolutely, yes, I want to do this. And again, I think that model does work fairly well for especially newer people. Most people, that's going to be how they feel the majority of the time, especially if they're vanilla and they're, you know, talking with a new person and wanting to interact with them physically. But again, when you get into asexuality and kink and long-term relationships and all other sorts of human complexities, most people at some point are going to experience a scenario where they want to say yes. They are able to say yes, but their yes is not a like, woo, yay, heck yes. It's more like a, sure, that sounds fine to me, and then afterwards we can get pizza, right? Like, they're not necessarily bouncing off the walls with joy, but they're still able to say yes to some degree. And I think within this enthusiastic consent framework, which is why I'm bringing it up here, that enthusiastic heck yes, to me at least, my interpretation of that is there's an idea of pleasure embedded in that you're saying heck yes because you're going to like it, you're going to find pleasure from it, you have historically enjoyed this thing. And then where does that leave room for all those other ways of experiencing various practices with other human beings? Like, not every single time is going to be amazing, bouncing off the walls, pleasurable. And this goes back to reinforcing pleasure equals consent, positivity equal consent, non-positivity, non-pleasure equal non-consent. And so I prefer, as I've talked about before, another model that's called, well, it's not really a model, it's just like I invented this. As far as I know, I invented it. Maybe somebody else has said this before, but I prefer to call it instead affirmative consent, which reinforces that core idea of saying yes to something, of being able to be in a position to say, yes, I want to do this, or no, I don't want to do this, and you are an active participant in that conversation, but there's not really a normative judgment on like how intense that yes should be. It's whatever you want it to be, right? It could be like, oh, okay, yeah, sure, this once is fine, all the way over to like, woo, yeah, oh my gosh, I can't wait to do it, let's do it right now. Like, super, like, I can't even like theoretically as an acting thing right now muster what that level of enthusiasm would be like, but you can be there if you want to. So it just like sort of broadens the possibility for how enthusiastic and how much you say yes and what that means to you personally. And building from there, I also want to point out to people that there is a happy medium that can exist between like, you must sign this 20-page contract before I will kiss you, and like never even getting the person's name first. Like, we can have some kind of compromise between these two positions, I think, without ruining the mood or losing the moment or what have you. I think if you're worried about ruining the mood, that's why it's better to have these conversations up front ahead of time before you get into that more hot and heavy scenario. You have time to talk about things in a fully rational, sober-minded place. I think, I'm not sure if there's studies about this, but I have to imagine at least some of the time, if you're waiting to do all of your negotiation until you're hot and heavy, ready in the moment, you might potentially say yes to things that you wouldn't otherwise say yes to if you were completely isolated from the scenario in the moment. And it's not necessarily always a problem to renegotiate in the middle of doing something else. But again, new partnerships, new people, new relationship, whatever it is you're getting into, usually better to hold off on that and build on that later once that initial level of trust has been established. So I think if what you want to do is to be able to have a level of spontaneity in your interactions, you talk about it beforehand, or at the very least, the absolute minimum bar that I think is usually a good idea is to have some kind of conversation about, hey, you know, for me, when it comes to our interactions, I really value getting to be able to be organic and spontaneous, and I know that means we don't always get to talk about everything that might be on the table ahead of time. Are you comfortable with that? What do you want this to look like? Give room for the other party to say what they want. And some people are going to be like, you know what, that doesn't really work out for me. I would prefer to talk about it in more detail. Can we compromise on that? Other people are going to be like, yes, I'm the exact same way. I really do prefer to be in the moment. I understand that it is a little bit more risky to do because we don't really know each other that well yet, but I'm okay taking on that level of risk if it means we get to have this other element to the experience we both enjoy. So there is a way to have that medium ground between never talking at all and talking for like 3 hours before you kiss. So there is a way. I just really want there to not be any more excuse from people who were like, I don't need to check in. Negotiation takes too much work. I can always read somebody's body language. I always know what's going on. I never get it wrong. I can always tell when they want more and they like something and when they don't. And it's like, sure they do, buddy. Sure. Okay, sure. I believe you. I don't really believe them. Like, it's such, especially with a new partner, like you are taking on such a high level of risk, and I don't want to hear it anymore that you cannot talk about anything at all ever because it will always ruin the moment. And I want to be very clear here. I have tried very hard to be inclusive to diverse experiences of consent and how we approach that because it is individual. I am simply talking about what I consider to be the best practice. I am an educator here on YouTube, and I know people are trying to find ways to have better interactions if they're getting back into dating for the first time in a long time, they're dating for the first time ever, whatever it is. I want people to know what I think the best tools are. You can choose to use different tools if you want to, but if those end up giving you bad results, you can't really say that I didn't warn you. But on that note, I do want to talk more about how this framework connects to consent and how this conversation connects to consent in a kink context in particular, because that's when it really gets confusing. Because this post was on one of the really big kink subreddits. It was somebody asking about a scenario they had experienced, and then somebody going and saying, as a relatively popular sentiment, you can tell if it was consensual or not based on how much you liked it. And sure, for some people that might work some of the time, but as you're getting into doing a lot of different kink stuff, whether that be getting into a power exchange relationship, being a service top, being a service submissive, being a masochist who enjoys suffering, somebody who wants to atone for things they've done wrong, somebody who wants to go through an ordeal or catharsis, then the matter of pleasure becomes very confusing. It's sort of a common refrain when talking about masochism that when you enjoy something, you can enjoy it because you don't enjoy it. Or you're enjoying that you don't enjoy it, and then you don't enjoy it afterwards because it feels bad, but it feeling bad makes you feel good. You can see how this gets very topsy-turvy. So if there is pleasure involved, it can be secondary to the experience, or you might not want to feel any pleasure at all. It sucks, it stays sucking, it sucked afterwards, you don't want to have it happen again. Like, there is a presenter that I've seen a couple of times who I don't really think teaches anymore, but they would talk about during some of their classes how they experienced kink largely as something that was like, in the moment, it sucked. They hated it. They were like, listen, I'm technically a masochist, but not really, because every single time my partner is doing this, that, and the other, I am hating the entire experience. It is intense. It is painful. I don't want to be there. But then afterwards, I feel good about getting to go through that because I suffered for my partner, or I came through something. Like, I was able to overcome something that felt really bad and I survived. I endured more than what I thought was possible for my body, and that makes me proud. And the good that they are experiencing from the scene is not the pleasure of it, the physical sensations that are positive for them, but the mental accomplishment, the emotional satisfaction, that's what feels good to them. So again, that is why it's so important for consent to be thought of not as a pleasure-based thing, but as something that arises from having conversations ahead of time, saying affirmatively, yes, I want to do that, no, I don't want to do this. Here's some gray areas. Here's some things I need to know. Here's what we need to work out in the moment as things are happening. Having that conversation, that is what is important. And if you were getting into a scenario where you're talking about doing something you think you're not really going to enjoy, like, I'll give a personal example, right? Like, I don't really like whips. I wish I did. They look really cool. People who do whips seem like cool people, and I can kind of enjoy them a little bit, but they are very, very intense for me. Like, every single time I'm hit with the whip, it's like, whoo, whoo, whoo. Like, it's like just a very short, sharp, very intense experience, and it gets my adrenaline going like nothing else I can think of in impact play. It runs through my body when I'm doing a whipping scene. So my consent around whipping is a little bit more complicated because I don't necessarily really like enjoy the whipping, because it feels kind of like what I imagine getting into a car crash feels like. Like, it's the adrenaline is so intense that it's not really like fun or pleasurable. It's just something that takes over your entire body. So when I'm negotiating for a whip scene now, I'll tell people about my history around it. I'll tell them what my experience is like. I will say, yes, I still want to do this. This is a suffering thing for me. This is what that looks like for me. Here's what you should expect. You know, I have very different scene negotiations when I am trying to negotiate for either a suffering-based scene or some kind of catharsis-based scene where it's like, listen, I just need to be hit really hard and find catharsis in that and be able to cry for like 2 hours. Can we do that? Or if it's more pleasure focused, if I want to be able to experience joy and happiness, that's one negotiation. And if it's more like a, hey, I need a challenge, I want to be able to get through this thing that I don't think I can get through, or I'm not really sure if I can. I want to build up my confidence with this implement. Can we do that? Also a different negotiation. So that just really proves the power of negotiation and why it's so important, because it's not as simple as just like, you know, is this thing okay for you or not? Like, there's so much nuance in terms of the inner emotional experience for the bottom as well as for the top too, because I haven't mentioned this yet, but this whole approach of consent strictly being pleasure focused also matters for tops as well. I mentioned service tops earlier. You can be a service top and enjoy giving people experiences that they want to experience and enjoy that aspect of it, even if you don't necessarily enjoy the literal things that you're doing. Like, I have played with partners before where they'll, for example, flog me. They're not really into floggers. It doesn't really do anything for them, but they consent to doing it with me because they enjoy my pleasure from it. They enjoy my experience of doing it, and they're happy to facilitate that experience for me, even though they're not really getting anything out of it directly for themselves. However, even in understanding that consent and pleasure can be nuanced, I do think it is worth monitoring things for a pattern, because a pattern can end up giving you a very different result than something that is a one-off. Now, it's one matter if you are somebody who needs to experience suffering or catharsis or atonement in your kink. If that's what you get out of doing BDSM and that's what you do, amazing, great. I am so glad that you found a way to make that work in your relationships or in your partnerships with other people. That's great. However, if you are somebody that is looking for something else with your kink, if you want to experience pleasure and enjoyment, either directly or secondarily, and that is not happening in your scenes at all, and over and over and over again, you are left doing scenes where at the end you feel used, discarded, taken advantage of, you feel sad, upset, angry even, that is a warning sign that you need to check in. You could be dealing with a scenario where your partner thinks you are experiencing what you want to be experiencing during a scene, and they could be confused or taken aback and be like, whoa, my gosh, I had no idea. I thought we were doing what you wanted to do. Let's fix it. They may need to recalibrate their expectations, how they read their body language, how they check in with you, their negotiation style. That can be fixed, absolutely. However, on the other hand, you may be dealing with somebody where they know that you don't enjoy it and they don't care because they're getting what they want out of the scenario. And they're going, well, you know, I'm the dom, I'm the top, so whatever I say goes. You should just enjoy being able to submit to me. I don't really care if you experience pleasure or not. That's on you. I got mine. Whatever happens to you is whatever happens to you. I don't care. And for some people, that's hot. That's their kink. And if that's you, be my guest. But I think most people want to have a little bit more emotional consideration for their kink and how their scenes are going. And if you don't want to be in that experience, if you want to have a partnership in your kink, not just a top-down structure of like, you're going to do whatever I want you to do and you're gonna like it because I told you to like it, like if that's not your kink, you don't have to stay there doing that. That's not implicit to any and all DS relationships. Kink in general, absolutely not. So you get to make the kinds of relationships and the kinds of scenes that you want to have. And if you feel like your partner is not seeing you like a whole equal, they don't care whether or not you're enjoying the experience or you're getting your needs met, yeah, that's going to be a big red flag for me. Because ultimately, I think even in a power exchange relationship, this complete, total, my way or the highway, I don't care what you think, that mentality is ultimately corrosive to most relationships. And it's one thing if it's a one time, we tried something, whoops, that didn't go super well, let's try it again a different way, versus my partner consistently doesn't care what I think about this. They don't care if I experience pleasure. They tell me to just shut up and take it because I'm the submissive and that's my lot in life. Or even taking that a step farther into, I feel like I have to say yes because I'm a submissive and my yes or no doesn't really matter because I'm a sub. And so really, I should always be saying yes. And if I say no, it's because I'm topping from the bottom. And to be clear, this can also happen to doms and tops as well. Doms and tops can also feel pressure to say yes to scenes because if they don't, they're not dominant enough, they're not going to impress their partner enough to keep them around, or they've done it before so they have to do it again. Pressure can exist for doms and tops as well, and I've talked about this before in other videos. I have one I did recently on topping from the bottom where I believe I cover this in more detail, but point is, if coercion exists in your relationship and somebody is making you feel like you have to say yes because if you don't say yes, here's a mountain of consequences, to me, that's not a good framework for a healthy long-term kink relationship. And when you're getting into more complicated models of consent, like consensual non-consent or free use, we would have to reopen that conversation and really get into some nuanced details of how to make that work in a healthier way for most people. But I think on the face of it, if you're in general doing kink and you're not doing like a CNC type relationship, coercion's not okay. Making it feel like you have to say yes all the time to everything is not okay. And yeah, there's nuance here. So with that being said, that's really what I wanted to say about enthusiastic consent and pleasure and consent, and just be aware of the fact that pleasure does not equal consent. And just because you made somebody feel really, really good during a scene, that doesn't mean it was necessarily consensual, or if you didn't, that doesn't mean it's non-consensual. This is a very complicated topic, but hopefully it made it a little bit more clear. Consent is a process, it's something you talk about explicitly and obtain through a mutual conversation, not through obtaining pleasure or not obtaining it through experiencing displeasure. It's, I think, actually more clear-cut than a lot of people assume that it is, and talking about things doesn't have to ruin the moment. With all that being said, I would love to know your thoughts about this one in a comment down below. What do you think about enthusiastic consent? What model do you use? How do you approach consent? Have you had experiences with this mentality of pleasure equal consent and non-pleasure equal non-consent? I would love to know what y'all are thinking in the comment section down below. If you did enjoy this, you're not already, please do subscribe because I make videos twice a week about all sorts of different kink and BDSM related topics. And finally, if you want to support what I do, the best way you can do that is on Patreon. A link to that will be down below. If you do already support me over there, thank you so, so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you all next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.